Part 5. The production of absolute and relative surplus value. Chapter 16. Absolute and relative surplus value. In considering the labor process, we began by treating it in the abstract, independently of its historical forms, as a process between man and nature. We stated in Chapter 5, if we look at the whole labor process from the point of view of its result, the product, it is plain that both the instruments of labor and the object of labor are means of production, and that the labor itself is productive labor. And in note number 8, we added further, this method of determining what is productive labor from the standpoint of the simple labor process is by no means sufficient to cover the capitalist process of production. We must now develop this point further. Insofar as the labor process is purely individual, the same worker unites in himself all the functions that later on become separated. When an individual appropriates natural objects for his own livelihood, he alone supervises his own activity. Later on, he is supervised by others. The solitary man cannot operate upon nature without calling his own muscles into play under the control of his own brain. Later on, they become separate, and this separation develops into a hostile antagonism. The product is transformed from the direct product of the individual producer into a social product, the joint product of a collective laborer, i.e. a combination of workers, each of whom stands at a different distance from the actual manipulation of the object of labor. With the progressive accentuation of the cooperative character of the labor process, there necessarily occurs a progressive extension of the concept of productive labor, and of the concept of the bearer of that labor, the productive worker. In order to work productively, it is no longer necessary for the individual himself to put his hand to the object. It is sufficient for him to be an organ of the collective laborer, and to perform any one of its subordinate functions. The definition of productive labor given above, the original definition, is derived from the nature of material production itself, and it remains correct for the collective laborer considered as a whole, but it no longer holds good for each member taken individually. Yet, the concept of productive labor also becomes narrower. Capitalist production is not merely the production of commodities, it is by its very essence the production of surplus value. The worker produces not for himself, but for capital. It is no longer sufficient, therefore, for him simply to produce. He must produce surplus value. The only worker who is productive is one who produces surplus value for the capitalist, or in other words, contributes towards the self-valorization of capital. If we may take an example from outside the sphere of material production, a schoolmaster is a productive worker when, in addition to belaboring the heads of his pupils, he works himself into the ground to enrich the owner of the school. That the latter has laid out his capital in a teaching factory instead of a sausage factory makes no difference to the relation. The concept of a productive worker therefore implies not merely a relation between the activity of work and its useful effect, between the worker and the product of his work, but also a specifically social relation of production, a relation with a historical origin which stamps the worker as capital's direct means of valorization. To be a productive worker is therefore not a piece of luck, but a misfortune. In Volume 4 of this work, which will deal with the history of the theory, we shall show that the classical political economists always made the production of surplus value the distinguishing characteristic of the productive worker. Hence, their definition of a productive worker varies with their conception of the nature of surplus value. Thus, the physiocrats insist that only agricultural labor is productive, since that alone, they say, yields a surplus value. For the physiocrats, indeed, surplus value exists exclusively in the form of ground rent. The prolongation of the working day, beyond the point at which the worker would have produced an exact equivalent for the value of his labor power, and the appropriation of that surplus labor by capital, this is the process which constitutes the production of absolute surplus value. It forms the general foundation of the capitalist system, and the starting point for the production of relative surplus value. The latter presupposes that the working day is already divided into two parts, necessary labor and surplus labor. In order to prolong the surplus labor, the necessary labor is shortened by methods for producing the equivalent of the wage of labor in a shorter time. The production of absolute surplus value turns exclusively on the length of the working day, whereas the production of relative surplus value completely revolutionizes the technical processes of labor and the groupings into which society is divided. It therefore requires a specifically capitalist mode of production, a mode of production which, along with its methods, means, and conditions, arises and develops spontaneously on the basis of the formal subsumption of labor under capital. This formal subsumption is then replaced by a real subsumption. It'll be sufficient if we merely refer to certain hybrid forms, in which, although surplus labor is not extorted by direct compulsion from the producer has not yet become formally subordinate to capital. In these forms, capital has not yet acquired a direct control over the labor process. Alongside the independent producers, who carry on their handicrafts or their agriculture in the inherited, traditional way, there steps the usurer or merchant with his usurer's capital or merchant's capital, which feeds on them like a parasite. The predominance of this form of exploitation in a society excludes the capitalist mode of production, although it may form the transition to capitalism as in the later Middle Ages. Finally, as in the case of modern domestic industry, certain hybrid forms are reproduced here and there against the background of large-scale industry, though their physiognomy is totally changed. A merely formal subsumption of labor under capital suffices for the production of absolute surplus value. It is enough, for example, that handicraftsmen who previously worked on their own account or as apprentices of a master should become wage laborers under the direct control of a capitalist. But we have seen how methods of producing relative surplus value are, at the same time, methods of producing absolute surplus value. Indeed, the unrestricted prolongation of the working day turned out to be a very characteristic product of large-scale industry. The specifically capitalist mode of production ceases in general to be a mere means of producing relative surplus value as soon as it has conquered an entire branch of production. This tendency is still more powerful when it has conquered all the important branches of production. It then becomes the universal, socially predominant form of the production process. It only continues to act as a special method of producing relative surplus value in two respects. First, insofar as it seizes upon industries previously only formally subordinate to capital, that is, insofar as it continues to proselytize, and second, insofar as the industries already taken over continue to be revolutionized by changes in the methods of production. From one standpoint, the distinction between absolute and relative surplus value appears to be illusory. Relative surplus value is absolute because it requires the absolute prolongation of the working day beyond the labor time necessary to the existence of the worker himself. Absolute surplus value is relative because it requires a development of the productivity of labor which will allow the necessary labor time to be restricted to a portion of the working day. But if we keep in mind the movement of surplus value, this semblance of identity vanishes. Once the capitalist mode of production has become the established and universal mode of production, the difference between absolute and relative surplus value makes itself felt whenever there is a question of raising the rate of surplus value. Assuming that labor power is paid for at its value, we are confronted with this alternative. On the one hand, if the productivity of labor and its normal degree of intensity is given, the rate of surplus value can be raised only by prolonging the working day in absolute terms. On the other hand, if the length of the working day is given, the rate of surplus value can be raised only by a change in the relative magnitudes of the components of the working day, i.e. necessary labor and surplus labor, and if wages are not to fall below the value of labor power, this change presupposes a change either in the productivity or the intensity of the labor. If the worker needs to use all his time to produce the necessary means of subsistence for himself and his family, he has no time left in which to perform unpaid labor for other people. Unless labor has attained a certain level of productivity, the worker will have no such free time at his disposal, and without superfluous time, there can be no surplus labor, hence no capitalists, as also no slave owners, no feudal barons, in a word, no class of large-scale landed proprietors. Thus, we may say that surplus value rests on a natural basis, but only in the very general sense that there is no natural obstacle absolutely preventing one man from lifting from himself the burden of the labor necessary to maintain his own existence and imposing it on another, just as there is no unconquerable natural obstacle to the consumption of the flesh of one man by another. It would be absolutely mistaken to attach mystical notions to this spontaneously developed productivity of labor, as is sometimes done. It is only when men have worked their way out of their initial animal condition, when therefore their labor has been to some extent socialized, that a situation arises in which the surplus labor of one person becomes a condition of existence for another. At the dawn of civilization, the productive powers acquired by labor are small, but so too are the needs which develop with and upon the means of their satisfaction. Furthermore, at that early period, the portion of society that lives on the labor of others is infinitely small compared with the mass of direct producers. As the social productivity of labor advances, this small portion of society increases both absolutely and relatively. Besides, the capital relation arises out of an economic soil that is the product of a long process of development. The existing productivity of labor, from which it proceeds as its basis, is a gift not of nature, but of a history embracing thousands of centuries. Even if we leave aside the question of the level of development attained by social production, the productivity of labor remains fettered by natural conditions. These conditions can all be traced back to the nature of man himself, and to the natural objects which surround him. External natural conditions can be divided from the economic point of view into two great classes, namely 1. Natural wealth in the means of subsistence, i.e. a fruitful soil, waters teeming with fish, etc., and 2. Natural wealth in the instruments of labor, such as waterfalls, navigable rivers, wood, metal, coal, etc. At the dawn of civilization, it is the first class that turns the scale. At a higher stage of development, it is the second. Compare, for example, England with India, or in ancient times Athens and Corinth with the shores of the Black Sea. The smaller the number of natural requirements imperatively calling for satisfaction, and the greater the natural fertility of the soil and the kindness of the climate, the smaller the amount of labor time necessary for the maintenance and reproduction of the producer. Hence, the greater the quantity of excess labor the producer can perform for others, in addition to the labor he does for himself. This was pointed out long ago by Diodorus when discussing the ancient Egyptians. Quote, "It is altogether incredible how little trouble and expense the bringing up of their children causes them. They cook for them the first simple food at hand. They also give them the lower part of the papyrus stem to eat, if it can be roasted in the fire, and the roots and stalks of the marsh plants, some raw, some boiled and roasted. Most of the children go without shoes and unclothed, since the air is very mild. Hence, a child, until he is grown up, costs his parents not more than 20 drachmas altogether. This is the main reason why the population of Egypt is so numerous, and therefore why so many great works can be undertaken." End quote. Nevertheless, the gigantic building projects of ancient Egypt owed less to the size of the population than to the large proportion of it that was freely disposable. Just as in the case of the individual worker, the less his necessary labor time, the more surplus labor he can provide. So in the case of the working population, the smaller the portion of it required for the production of the necessary means of subsistence, the greater the portion of it available for other work. If we assume capitalist production then, with all other circumstances remaining the same, and the length of the working day a given factor, the quantity of surplus labor will vary according to the natural conditions within which labor is carried on, in particular the fertility of the soil. But it by no means follows, inversely, that the most fertile soil is the most fitted for the growth of the capitalist mode of production. The latter presupposes the domination of man over nature. Where nature is too prodigal with her gifts, she keeps him in hand, like a child in leading strings. Man's own development is not in that case a nature-imposed necessity. The mother country of capital is not the tropical region with its luxuriant vegetation, but the temperate zone. It is not the absolute fertility of the soil, but its degree of differentiation, the variety of its natural products, which forms the natural basis for the social division of labor, and which, by changes in the natural surroundings, spurs man on to the multiplication of his needs, his capacities, and the instruments and modes of his labor. It is the necessity of bringing a natural force under the control of society, of economizing on its energy, of appropriating or subduing it on a large scale by the work of the human hand, that plays the most decisive role in the history of industry. Thus, for example, the regulation of the flow of water in Egypt, Lombardy, and Holland, or irrigation in India, Persia, and so on, where artificial canals not only supply the soil with the water indispensable to it, but also carry down mineral fertilizers from the hills in the shape of sediment. The secret of the flourishing state of industry in Spain and Sicily, under the rule of the Arabs, lay in their irrigation works. Favorable natural conditions can provide in themselves only the possibility, never the reality, of surplus labor, nor accordingly the reality of surplus labor and a surplus product. The result of differences in the natural conditions of labor is this: the same quantity of labor satisfies a different mass of requirements in different countries, and consequently, under otherwise analogous circumstances, the quantity of necessary labor time is different. These conditions affect surplus labor only as natural limits, i.e. by determining the point at which labor for others can begin. In proportion as industry advances, these natural limits recede. In the midst of our Western European society, where the worker can only purchase the right to work for his own existence by performing surplus labor for others, it is very easy to imagine that it is an inherent quality of human labor to furnish a surplus product. But consider, for example, an inhabitant of the islands of the East Indies, where sago grows wild in the forests. Quote, "When the inhabitants have convinced themselves, by boring a hole in the tree, that the pith is ripe, the trunk is cut down and divided into several pieces. The pith is extracted, mixed with water, and filtered. It is then quite fit for use as sago. One tree commonly yields 300 pounds, and occasionally 500 to 600 pounds. There, then, people go into the forest and cut bread for themselves, just as with us they cut firewood." Suppose now that an East Indian bread cutter of this kind requires 12 working hours a week for the satisfaction of all his needs. Nature's direct gift to him is plenty of leisure time. Before he can apply this leisure time productively for himself, a whole series of historical circumstances is required. Before he spends it in surplus labor for others, compulsion is necessary. If capitalist production were introduced, the good fellow would perhaps have to work 6 days a week in order to appropriate to himself the product of one working day. In that case, the bounty of nature would not explain why he now has to work 6 days a week, or why he must provide 5 days of surplus labor. It explains only why his necessary labor time would be limited to 1 day a week. But in no case would his surplus product arise from some innate occult quality of human labor. Thus, both the historically developed productive forces of labor in society and its naturally conditioned productive forces appear as productive forces of the capital into which that labor is incorporated. Ricardo never concerns himself with the origin of surplus value. He treats it as an entity inherent in the capitalist mode of production, and in his eyes the latter is the natural form of social production. Whenever he discusses the productivity of labor, he seeks in it not the cause of the existence of surplus value, but the cause that determines the magnitude of that value. On the other hand, his school is loudly proclaimed that the productive power of labor is the originating cause of profit. Read surplus value. This is at least an advance in comparison with the mercantilists, who derive the excess of the price of a product over its cost of production from the act of exchange, from the sale of the product above its value. Nevertheless, Ricardo's school also merely evaded the problem rather than solving it. In fact, these bourgeois economists instinctively and rightly saw that it was very dangerous to penetrate too deeply into the burning question of the origin of surplus value. But what are we to think of John Stuart Mill, who, half a century after Ricardo, solemnly claims superiority over the mercantilists by clumsily repeating the wretched evasions of Ricardo's earliest vulgarizers? Mill says, quote, "The cause of profit is that labor produces more than is required for its support." So far, nothing but the old story, but Mill, wishing to add something of his own, proceeds as follows. To vary the form of the theorem, the reason why capital yields a profit is because food, clothing, materials, and tools last longer than the time which was required to produce them. Here he confuses the duration of labor time with the duration of its products. On this view, a baker, whose products last only a day, could never extract the same profit from his workers as a machine manufacturer, whose products last for 20 years or more. Of course, it is very true that if a bird's nest did not last longer than the time it takes to build, the birds would have to do without nests. This fundamental truth once established, Mill asserts his own superiority over the mercantilists. We thus see that profit arises not from the incident of exchange, but from the productive power of labor, and the general profit of the country is always what the productive power of labor makes it, whether any exchange takes place or not. If there were no division of employments, there would be no buying or selling, but there would still be a profit. For Mill, then, exchange, buying, and selling, i.e. the general conditions of capitalist production, are a mere incident, and there would always be profits even without the purchase and sale of labor power. If, he continues, the laborers of the country collectively produce 20% more than their wages, profits will be 20%, whatever prices may or may not be. This is, in one respect, a rare piece of tautology. For if the workers produce a surplus value of 20% for the capitalist, his profit will be related to their total wages in the proportion 20 to 100. Nevertheless, it is absolutely false because they are calculated upon the sum total of the capital advanced. If, for example, the capitalist has advanced 500 pounds, of which 400 pounds is laid out in means of production and 100 pounds in wages, and if the rate of surplus value is 20%, the rate of profit will be 20 to 500, i.e. not 20% but 4%. There follows a splendid example of Mill's way of handling the different historical forms of social production. I assume throughout the state of things which prevails with few exceptions universally, the state in which the laborers and capitalists are separate classes, namely, that the capitalist advances the whole expenses, including the entire remuneration of the laborer. Strange optical illusion to see everywhere a situation which as yet exists only exceptionally on our earth. But let us proceed. Mill is good enough to make this concession. That he should do so is not a matter of inherent necessity. On the contrary, the laborer might wait until the production is complete for all that part of his wages which exceeds mere necessaries, and even for the whole if he has funds in his hand sufficient for his temporary support. But in the latter case, the laborer is to that extent really a capitalist in the concern, by supplying a portion of the funds necessary for carrying it on. Mill might just as well have said that the worker who advances to himself not only the means of subsistence, but also the means of production is in reality his own wage laborer, or indeed that the American peasant is his own slave, because he does forced labor for himself instead of doing it for someone who is his master. After thus proving clearly that capitalist production would still continue to exist even if it did not exist, Mill now proceeds, quite consistently, to show that it would not exist even if it did exist. And even in the former case, where the worker is a wage laborer to whom the capitalist advances the whole of his means of subsistence, he, the worker, may be looked upon in the same light, i.e. as a capitalist, since, contributing his labor at less than the market price, he may be regarded as lending the difference to his employer and receiving it back with interest, etc. In reality, the worker advances his labor gratuitously to the capitalist during, say, 1 week, in order to receive its market price at the end of the week, etc. According to Mill, this makes him into a capitalist. On a level plane, simple mountains look like hills, and the insipid flatness of our present bourgeoisie is to be measured by the altitude of its great intellects.